Hello, my fluffy little bunnies, and welcome to the second episode of the International Dagger Symposium. Today, we being Björn and me, whom you know from the first episode, are being joined by Karin Verelst, who will be so kind, I hope, as to give us a short introduction of herself and basically answering the question for herself personally of, Karin, why daggers though?
Why daggers? Well, let's first start with IFHEMA, which I started in 2008 in a group in Antwerp, Sparta, which was and is still led by Alwin Goedhals. Maybe he's a bit older now in HEMA terms, but he was quite often on international events. And in that group, we trained always with wrestling, dagger and longsword from the start. I did this for 10 years. I trained there for 10 years. So this got simply ingrained in my system. And I still find it hard to find groups doing longsword without either wrestling or dagger, preferably both. In my own group, which I have now in Brussels at the Free University, sadly enough, we don't have time to do wrestling and dagger every training, not yet. Hopefully next year we will go to 2 trainings a week and not just one, then that would change. But at least we do wrestling and sometimes dagger, and I think it's such a basic datum to any kind of martial combat with edged weapons, to be able to fight on the short distance and to defend and fight with the most dangerous weapon, with the most dangerous weapon, as Fiore calls it, namely the dagger. And also, dagger is so fun. It's just incredibly fun. So why daggers? One, because they are in the sources. Two, because I was trained by a good trainer for 10 years by them. Three, because I like them. And four, what else of an excuse do you need?
No, no more.
Yeah, you touched on some points there that we made in the first episode as well. So if anyone's interested in us delving more into that topic of what a great didactic tool this is and how much you can learn about basically every weapon from doing ringen and dagger, watch the first episode. Just a quick follow-up question. You said you started basically doing wrestling and dagger and longsword. Was that like all at the same time, or was it like
Yes.
in that order? Did you start with wrestling and then do dagger and then do longsword?
No, this group trained every Sunday. They had 2 trainings, either 4 hours, either 6 hours in a row with a small break. And there was always an hour of wrestling, almost an hour of wrestling, almost an hour of dagger, and the rest of the time was longsword. So this was my normal,
Routine,
how would I say,
basically.
environment in HEMA terms. And I speak about 2008, 9, 10, 11, really at the beginning. And this gave me a solid ground and a solid grounding in this approach. And I'm still a little bit surprised that this is not the normal way. It should be, I think.
Yeah. It should be.
I agree.
Yeah. All right. Today, we are going to talk about what makes training dagger different from training other weapon systems or just weapons in HEMA. We are going to talk about the differences in the physiological aspect. So how is it actually bodily, physically different from doing dagger? How is that different from doing the longsword or the langes messer or what have you? And we will talk about how is it psychologically different? How does it feel different to fight with a dagger as opposed to the other weapons? This might end up being a several-part episode. We'll see how far we get today. We will start with the physiological differences. Shouldn't it be kind of the same thing for me as a HEMA fighter, whether I fight with a dagger or a rapier or a longsword? Why is there a difference? Maybe Björn would like to give a first attempt at an answer.
So, well, theoretically, yes. And I think that, as I've mentioned before, in my goal for dagger is exactly that it shouldn't be much of a difference, that it should be possible to train with it and to spar with it and to fight with it in exactly the same way. However, I think that for many people it isn't, and And perhaps the reason is that it becomes very almost like too personal or too close. It is perhaps a little bit more, in the fact, due to it being a shorter weapon, it is somewhat more strength and mass dependent than a longer weapon like a rapier and longsword. And there is also, I think, perhaps the reason that it becomes different is that a lot of fencers in HEMA aren't used to that kind of volatile nature of that it becomes very fast with the dagger, because it turns into this, has a tendency to become very, very physical and close, and not everybody's used to that. Does that answer the question, or did I miss?
I think so. So basically what you're saying is that if everyone was doing HEMA the way that you see it should be done, then there wouldn't be a difference, because everyone would be fighting as if they were fighting dagger. Is that kind of the gist of it?
I mean, there would always be some differences due to the just size of the weapon, and that dictates distance and, you know, the close to grappling and all these kind of things that we talked about. But I think that the main reason that there's a difference is that people don't train it. I think that this is a bigger difference than and when they do train it, very often they treat it as some sort of casual exception. It's like, okay, we're going to have some fun once per 6 months, and we're going to do a bit of dagger. And very often they're really surprised that it doesn't work, what they're doing. Their attempts at doing it is like, oh, then they try sparring, for example, and all of a sudden they're like, but none of my techniques works. Yeah, well, because you didn't put in the amount of training you did with the long sword. There's kind of self-explanatory in my world, but maybe it isn't.
All right, so basically longsword training or rapier training or whatever doesn't, or the way that you see it done, doesn't train me to do things that I then miss for doing dagger properly.
Yes.
Okay, what are those things specifically? Can you single out like one or two that we might delve into more?
Yes, so I think we can differentiate it into the physical and the psychological. I'll leave the psychological a little bit alone for now, because we'll come back to that as is the plan. Physiologically, it is the moment you start, the shorter the weapon, the more size and mass matters. So of the proponent, in my opinion. That doesn't mean that it is like that it will always be the most important, because I don't think so at all. But this makes it, changes it very much from, for example, a sword, for example, a rapier or a longsword. It is easier to compensate with strength, which is a bad thing for people who are big and strong, because it tends to be that we, as I'm speaking about me as being relatively big, have the unfortunate opportunity to compensate with strength. And that makes our techniques worse, but also makes us unpleasant to train with. Because if you can compensate with strength, it very often turns into not pleasant for your training partner. And that's a bad thing. Something I have had to work with myself on. Does that kind of make sense?
I think so. Is that an experience that you have made as well, Karin? That dagger is that, or let's put it the other way, that longer weapons are kind of making the battlefield more level, and that dagger is more unfair in that regard?
I agree with a lot of things that Bjorn said, but that's maybe the only one where I do not completely agree. I will come to that immediately. I think that dagger fighting, training and sparring, although I think training and sparring are two different subjects here, because of course, either training or sparring, we don't train with sharps, and we certainly do not spar with sharps. We have to keep this in mind if we understand what would be the real advantage or disadvantage of being a big, strong, slow guy. I mean, I think this is a bit different. It's not like in wrestling. In wrestling, what Björn says would be true in the sense that their strength and being bigger most of the time, not always necessarily, but most of the time will be a clear advantage if the people that are compared have the same level of training, of course, the same level of technicality, because otherwise a good trained person can outdo a lesser trained, big, strong guy, nevertheless. But with the dagger, I would dare to doubt this. If we train dagger properly, we should always keep in mind that this is a sharp weapon which immediately wounds when you're touched by it, even quicker and more efficiently than the longsword, or maybe also the rapier, but I'm not familiar enough with rapier to make statements about this. So I think that you can be as big and strong as you wish in dagger fighting. I think if the other person is trained well, because we always forget, and there I again agree with Björn, that dagger fighting is very technical fighting. I mean, it requires a lot of technical knowledge to do it properly if you want at least a chance to survive a real confrontation. But then if you're small and speedy, you have as much opportunity to kill your bigger opponent than the other way around, I think. But, and this we find, by the way, somewhere in the sources already mentioned as well, if it's gezelliges vechten, if it's not on life and death, you of course are not going to use the sharpened weapon to fight your opponent, not in the training and also not in the sparring. And then this advantage that you have as a smaller and more speedy opponent can, to a large extent, maybe disappear, or at least to some extent. And then in the as if situation of our training and sparring, this becomes more obviously true, although I still would say that for dagger fighting, if you train it properly and take into account that in principle a touch is a wound, a good touch is a wound, you can outdo this kind of effect largely, I think. Because just running in and taking somebody and getting hit with the dagger and taking it for granted, I don't consider as proper dagger fighting, not sparring and not training either. So I have a little bit of a different idea on this aspect of dagger fighting. All the rest I agree with, the fact that the bodily closeness makes it very different from longsword and rapier. It is closer to wrestling than it is to either of those. Of course, certain biomechanic things like the keeping of the central line and the using of the stable triangles in the footwork, in the shoulders, and the verbotene stuk on the head, but leave that aside. That always plays a big role in all weapons. But since the distance is so much shorter, not only the unease, people are not used to work on this distance. In my training, I use part of my initial trainings to get people used to touch each other's body. And that will already take some time. They need to touch and grab and lift and with bodies of other people, men or women, by the way, in a neutral way. This already takes time, but this pays off richly to do this effort in the beginning of getting them to that point so that they lose this gêne and this embarrassment, blah, blah, blah. That's one step. And then the second step is because it is so close, it's much closer in. It's not just wrestling. You can compare it to some extent also with boxing, English boxing. Yeah, okay. So the first point I mentioned was this bodily presence and that it is necessary to do training efforts, focusing on this to get people over this, which is, by the way, true for wrestling as well. And the second is, I think, intensity. So because the distance is shorter, everything goes quicker. You have to be much more alert. This is one of the reasons, as Björn correctly mentioned, for the psychological stress which is added to it, which we will discuss on another occasion, I understand. So, but this intensity requires specific training. You need to be fast, you need to be very alert, and you need, it's often shorter time of fightings, but the height of the intensity required is much more elevated, I think. And Most people do not train on this either. It requires a specific approach, which you, even if you do competition longsword, do not get in the same way as you would need it for doing dagger, I think. And that more or less sums up what I want to say up to this moment.
Can I just ask a question? Because this is, the reason that I kind of talk a little bit about strength or size is that in part because the weapon is smaller, so there's no leverage, of course. So which I think is kind of true, regardless. But also the sources mostly seem to mostly deal with quite large attacks, and large attacks by necessity kind of has to have some power behind them, or they really will only be big and slow, right? What is your thoughts on that? Because for me, that the conclusion is that, okay, there has to be power because the attacks seem to be big, because all the defenses that are described, as I understand them, seem to be geared towards dealing with relatively big attacks. There's nothing against attacks that go like this, right? There's quite big, clear attacks, in my opinion. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I would agree. I understand what you mean. I was not talking about mesvechten in the modern sense. I think there it is extremely difficult in whatever situation to properly defend against such a thing. I think the best defense in that case is run as fast as you can.
Not be there.
Yeah. Yeah, voila. But the larger attacks, because the daggers are also larger, they are very often also already taking into account that you have to pierce through big clothes or through the holes in armor or things like that. You're very often used to use leverage and such things. I do agree with that. And I do not say that strength does not play any matter, although we should take into account that being big and being at the same amount of strength does not always go automatically together as well. You can be a bit slimmer and be very athletic and have enough strength in your own right, nevertheless, but that's another discussion. But I think that this relative slowliness of the dagger fighting in the medieval style in the different sources, both the Italian and the German ones, just allows for a more technical approach. I don't think that you need only strength to be able to execute these techniques. It is precisely because they are so well understood geometrically and with respect to the lines, etc., and moving out and in and all this kind of things, using the joints, the locks of the joints and things like that. That okay, if maybe let's say it like that. Maybe you should be able to withstand the initial assault. There I can understand you better. If you can somehow block or escape that one and you can follow up, I think that the real, unless you're standing, pushing face to face and blah, 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 but there is also a lot of techniques allowing you to break just this kind of situation. So I do not want to negate that strength plays any role at all. That would be ridiculous, but I would not reduce it to that. I would really not. Let's remember that the master says that if it were only about strength, then it would be not art at all, right?
So we basically have to differentiate between what I think in the German tradition is called a Büffel, like a buffalo, which is a person who solely relies on being big and strong, which is not a criticism of people being big and strong. It doesn't mean that people who are big and strong fight technically, it just means they rely on being big and strong.
Yes.
They make up for the lack of technique by being big and strong, because basically if you are big and strong, you have more reach, you have more mass, you have more strength maybe, then you are like here by default, and some other people have to work on the technique to get on the same level and beat you. And if you solely rely on that, then that's what is called a buffalo, a Büffel in the German tradition. And of course that is has been criticized back then, and it would be criticized by us as not proper fighting, not proper fencing. But I think the idea is that, or what I would like to delve into is, we have made the connection between dagger fighting and ringen, wrestling. You said in the beginning of your explanations, Karin, that in wrestling you do see more of an advantage for big and strong people, as you see in dagger. This close connection being there, does that mean that the advantage of a big and strong person grows as soon as we get into the grappling, and that the smaller, more slimly built person would have to basically keep a bit out of the wrestling and try to keep in the Zufechten longer? Is that kind of what we're getting at, or is
Do you mean with the dagger or just in the wrestling as well?
I mean with the dagger now, because basically when we look at dagger fighting, if we look at the techniques, we get very little about the actual like stabbing and like fighting at a distance, and we get a lot of techniques for what happens when you get attacked, and then you block that and you do levers, and we get into the actual ringen.
Yes.
Do you think that there is an advantage there? If we get to the ringen part, is there an advantage for the bigger, stronger people, or is it just as
No, I
easy?
don't. I think in this respect, and even then, because in ringen is also the distinction between gezelliges and in ernst. In ernst, meaning that you can do all the. I teach courses of self-defense. I can tell you that there are for smaller and lighter people a lot of ways to undo a big and strong opponent if he's not very attentive to it. Before he knows, he loses an eye, or his nose is in his brain, or his what is this in English? Has been broken, and blah blah blah. But of course, again, being strong and fast and well trained puts you in an advantage if you have the three together, but you very rarely encounter these three at the same level at the same time. I think that the problem is always that also, not always, is also that the smaller person already might think, because of this typical idea, I'm not going to make this. While in a real fight, you have to be confident. And I admit that this was and is for me, myself, still a problem from time to time as well. It took me a lot of time to overcome this, because as a woman, you're even more handicapped by this idea. You're not capable, you cannot do it, blah, 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 blah. Even if you're bigger than the guy before you, you have to imagine this. So there the psychology comes in again. But it's not for nothing that the book shows us the techniques in the short distance, because fighting in the Zufechten distance against the dagger, I think, is the most stupidest thing you can do. If you are in the Zufechten distance and you doubt anyhow your capacity to master the situation, then you run the fuck as fast away as you can. There is no reason to stay there at points length of a deadly weapon that can, no. That's I think if you are in a dagger fight, especially a dagger fight which is for real, and we should always try in our training to take the for real into account, then you shorten the distance as quickly as you can, but taking into account first that this person, let's now suppose that you don't have the dagger necessarily, he does, or maybe you both have, but in any case, this person will hold on to his dagger for a while, and this person, while if you're well trained, you will know how you can get hold of this weapon. You have to get control of this weapon by shortening the distance and by blocking somehow the arm that uses this weapon. And then you have all these nice little things like joints, hands, body parts that you can lock, break, use as a leverage to throw over a big person who hangs over you, wanting to stab you. Very nice. You turn in and you throw him. So I don't say this is easy. This is very difficult, and it demands a lot of training and psychology to be able to get it working, but it is possible.
Yeah.
So I think that, in my opinion at least, and based on the sources that I have worked with, which is predominantly Joachim Meyer, but also based on my outside experience, there's a difference if there is a dagger versus dagger scenario, and there is a situation where one is unarmed and one is armed and has a dagger. I would agree 100% with you if you now speak from a situation where one has a dagger and one has not. If both have a dagger, then I think there's lots of merit about staying in the Zufechten. Okay. I think that is pretty clear in Meyer that is what he wants you to do in the beginning. All of his techniques basically start from the guards, and it starts like when you are in the zu fechten, that's like literally the first sentence of almost all the techniques, which tells me that there's a lot of focus on fighting in the zu fechten. And I think that has actually been quite a bit of my focus, because I want there to be fencing to the same degree in the dagger versus dagger, which is what I mostly am interested in. I don't spend lots of time on empty hand versus dagger. I do a little bit, but not as much. But I think that the moment one person doesn't have a dagger, I think I would agree 100% with you. Also, I would say that I think that my point was a bit like Jan talked about the buffel, that the idea is that the point is that it's very easy for somebody who has the strength and mass on his side to compensate or to rely on that, and therefore not to learn the technique. Whereas somebody who don't have that to rely on has no choice but to rely on the technique. I think there was a very nice example of this when at the last Tremonia Fechten, I had two guys that were going like super hard with each other, and in the end their lower arms were so swollen that they couldn't continue day two, and I had two girls that were going at least as intense, but they just didn't smack each other's hands out. They did other things instead, and they in the end got more training in because they didn't try to destroy each other's lower arms. And I think that was a typical example of this. These two guys, they tried to use their strength, which is very natural when you have the advantage of that, or the perceived advantage.
Can I say something to that? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in that what you just said, Björn, sounds a bit like the intensity aspect that Karin talked about. Seems to work as like a magnifier. So you can have the disadvantage as a big and strong person in longsword to rely on your strength, but it's even more so in dagger where it's close and nasty. And maybe there are other things as well that kind of are just like you have that in other weapons as well. But because dagger is so close and because it's so intense and so volatile, you notice that way more often and more strongly. Just like we talked about last time, where we said dagger is a good training tool because everything you that is demanded of you, the fühlen aspect of it all, you can learn through a dagger and through ringen way more easily than mitigated by two longswords. Maybe it's the same thing with these physical differences. Maybe we feel them more strongly in the dagger. That was kind of what I wanted to sum up what you've just said and what I think how it ties in with what Karin has said before. But please continue.
Yeah, well, of course, I must admit that I was talking indeed in first instance about somebody being attacked with a dagger and not necessarily having a dagger, him or herself, which you find more in the older sources. I agree. I must admit that
Would you like to, because Björn has stated that he primarily studies Maya, would you like to state what your primary sources are so people listening can kind of sort it in?
Well, in first instance, in the school where I used to be before, we trained a lot of the Fiore dagger because it's a very clear and simple and very efficient system, referring, by the way, explicitly to the wrestling program. But of course, the German corpus is much broader and richer. So we did, and I continue to work on this. I like Wallerstein. I also like some of the Thalhofer stuff. And there are things in Paulus Hector Meyer, which I also very much like, although it is not always clear where he has gotten his mustard from. But the system of Joachim Meyer, I must honestly admit, I never studied it. I never looked at it. So it's perfectly possible what you say. And I would also, of course, admit that if two people holding a dagger are facing each other, like in a kind of dueling situation, I imagine this, or like in a training situation, it can be life and death, by the way. It's always very dangerous. That then this would change the situation. Although I still think that, yeah, unless you want to do some kind of sword fighting with mini swords like daggers, my temptation would be nevertheless to close the distance in a safe way as quickly as possible and use my dagger to pierce that guy to death.
Yeah, I think the idea with Maya, but Björn, you are the authority from us on that because I mainly study Fiore as well, is to stay in the Zufechten distance until you don't, basically, right? So you try to look for a good hit, and then you close in and you commit and you go in like full force, committed to the strike, and that's when the wrestling and grappling happens, right? But before you don't. Maya puts a little bit more emphasis on the part that comes before, whereas like Fiore and a lot of like Hundfeld and Lignitzer, they just start with, and he stabs you. Okay, right, react. Which and Maya seems to lay more focus on, yeah, but how do I get there? Is that kind of the idea?
I agree with your summary, yes.
I think so. I think that it's true. I think that first of all, Meyer, he has this idea about for example, the provoker, taker, hitter, which is like one of the primary concepts in Meyer, where so basically you're probing your way in to see if you can find a safe way in, and once you got a safe way where you can control, and you build up a sequence of reference points on the way. It's like, do I have a safe point now? Do I have a safe point now? Do I have a safe point? And at any of those points, you should be able to back out and realize I don't have a safe point now, because then it's better to retreat out. Because of course, being in Zufechten or further is delicious. Nobody gets hurt. It's the best place to be, right? So from that perspective, I think so. Also, I think that especially with the dagger part, but I mean, Joachim Meyer is Lichtenauer. He, in my opinion, he's like just the end of the Lichtenauer, perhaps, but he is that. And
yes, I agree.
And he, what is typical for Meyer is that especially his 1570 manual is an attempt at teaching somebody who doesn't know anything from the beginning. Yes. And teaching him a complete system. Mm-hmm. Whereas the older systems the older the source material, very often it's just the house book, and what you got is like I looked into the BPL 3281, this Dutch Vechtbook. There is no beginning and there's no end, and what you got in is you get dropped in the middle. So maybe there was more of this before, we just don't have it surviving, or it is the problem with the survivor bias, right? Is it that the earlier sources focused more on being closed, or is it just that this is what survived, or is it what was taught, or because sometimes it's just a collection.
Survived as in the sources survived, not like the people who did this survive, the sources that survived.
Yes. So survivor bias in this context, I mean, like what has survived as material, because it's not that we don't know if it's not complete. We know it's not complete. We absolutely know it's incomplete in very many situations.
Yes. Can I add something?
Yes, please.
Because of course it makes perfect sense what you say, but we should not forget, as you say, that Meyer Joachim teaches a whole system. He's already I agree with you that he's the endpoint of Lichtenauer. Right? There is a close, intense continuity connection, but he is 16th century. We forget always that people used being taught by the people knowing the older sources and using the sources, or just orally. That's even not clear to us how this really worked, but these people were supposed to know already a lot of things, and then especially on the level of using your body, knowing what distance is. Basics of grappling were probably known by everybody, simply because everybody was playing and practicing this and doing this on kermesses or in the court or wherever the social status of this person would allow it. But also things like dancing. If you look at paintings of Bruegel, even the normal people, by the way, both men and women, they dance and they have clearly a very good understanding of distance, speed, how to work with somebody's body. It's not coincidental that if you look in early 16th century music manuals with early notation for playing instruments, etc., you will find instructions for footwork, for dances. And these instructions are so close to what you see in many fighting disciplines that it is clear that there was a connection. By the way, in later times, we see that dancing teacher and fencing teacher often is the same person. So I think it's not just a matter of what is left of what got lost, but I indeed think that many of these manuscripts, like the house book, but also the Dutch one you mentioned, they simply start into the middle because they don't see any use for writing down how you have to put your feet when you approach somebody and takes his arm. You see, so there is a different perspective there.
Yeah, I agree, and sometimes it's very clear, especially that manual, because sometimes there's like, yeah, one guy holds you like this and the other guy holds you like that, and whoever stabs first loses, and there's no explanation of how that is supposed to happen. So as very clearly he's assuming you know something. Assuming the author is a he, but never mind. The author assumes that you know something already, and I think it's true. There's a little anecdote to this that I would like to add, and that when I grew up, I'm originally from Norway, and in Norway there's like a dance that is performed solo, which is called laus or halling, which is essentially like a very acrobatic. It kind of looks like a Scandinavian capoeira, right? And one of my friends, he's a professional dancer in this. He did a comparison between martial arts and this dance, and this dance is documented to medieval times, and the connections are so close that it's the overlap is very real, and that is in what we have today. Is we have to remind ourselves that what survives today as that dance is probably quite far removed from how it looked originally, because things change over time. But still, after so many years, you can still clearly see this. So I think you're 100% correct. I think this movement culture, and I think there was also an instance where Oscar Termors, is that his?
Yes,
Termors?
yes.
He
the Dutch Messer guy.
Yes. He made this video where he talked about how the movement, the German movement culture of the time, where he showed that this twisting of the hips and things that we see in Meyer and in Lekuchner, it is also there in the dancing, and you can see it in statues and in paintings, and it's all over. So I think you're 100% correct. I think you're spot on.
Okay, thank you.
We have delved a bit into the sources and what they, and that's totally fine. But to bring it back to the topic of getting physical, basically, is that also a thing that you think is special to dagger, or at least more pronounced in dagger? This idea of you will damn well notice if you're doing it wrong. Is that more pronounced in dagger than it is with the longsword? Wouldn't you have to be as good a dancer for dagger as you would have for longsword? Which is a weird question to ask, but in context it makes sense.
It makes perfect sense, I think. I don't think you should be better or worse for longsword than for dagger. It's just I think this is what comes about from the whole discussion, in a somewhat different way. Okay, in a very abstract sense, you can say it should not matter, but the real situation, the tempo is different, the measure of the distance is different, the time of reaction is different, the intensity, which is not the same as the strength. Intensity also means speed, for instance.
Or commitment.
And voila. So this is all different and heightened to a certain extent. So this will make the situation indeed otherwise. I think many dances are closer to the dagger distance than to the sword distance, although this is probably true more for certain types of dancing and maybe for certain periods in history, because we see evolutions there as well. Up to the 17th century, the distance between the bodies becomes bigger again. So there is a cultural change going on. But of course, since it becomes more physical in the most direct sense, it will, add to the intensity, and the imbalances between the opponents will tend to become bigger. But again, being bigger or heavier in itself is not enough. Not always the smallest guy or girl. We can talk about girls in a minute as well, but will lose. It depends on a lot of more factors, and the fact that you already think, if you're smaller, that you probably will lose adds to the problem of not being capable of taking the overhand a lot. I think we should not underestimate this. But again, in theory, a person who is stronger and equally well trained and as self-confident as a smaller opponent normally should win. But this again is a situation that you rarely will encounter, I think.
Yeah. There's this kind of line that one of our trainers at our club likes to say when it's about this topic. It's like in the history of martial arts, it's never been a disadvantage to be stronger and bigger than your opponent, right? You just have to, if you don't rely on it, if you don't get bad at technique because you're big and strong, that would be the kind of disadvantage that Björn has been talking about. But just
what
by
about
being
the
bigger
small
and
and
stronger.
strong? What about the small and strong?
Yeah,
guy?
sure. I mean, the thing there being, if we are on the same level in terms of technique, if I am like bigger, have more reach, I have a slight advantage. If I'm stronger, I have a slight advantage, as long as the technique is equal. So
but you are slower. You will be slower, for instance. I'm now playing the devil's advocate, of course. Eh?
Yeah, sure. So I think that the point of the big guy being necessarily slower is something that we all know from pop culture, and this weird idea that we all have that things
but
must
then
level out in the end.
The small
right?
guy being necessarily weaker is also a pop culture idea. You can say that.
Definitely, yeah. So there's this thing about, like, if we assume that we are on the same level technique-wise, we are on the same level speed-wise, then being bigger and stronger. As you said, if I'm the bigger and stronger guy on that terms, I should win. It's an advantage there. And maybe it helps to get across basically to get away with a few things in my technique that other people wouldn't get away with. For example, me just being stronger, going into a dagger fight, I don't have to execute my technique as cleanly to floor a person that is smaller and weaker than me, physically weaker than me, as this person would have to floor me, basically, because they would have to make sure that they execute their technique more perfectly. It's like, it's not impossible for them to do it. It's just, if they do the technique wrong, they don't have this kind of cop out of being, okay, I just run into them and let my body master do work.
In wrestling, I would buy this more than in dagger fighting, but I saw Björn's finger and I think he wants to add something.
Yeah, sure.
I think that there is, first of all, I think we can say athleticism is always great.
Voilà.
If you are athletically strong and flexible, and that is always an advantage.
There I agree.
Being big and small, having mass can be, I mean, there's the simple fact that we have weight categories in boxing, for example. So of course the pure fact that the force behind my punch will be greater than somebody who weighs half as much as me, even if they are technically very good. But that is, like you said, something that it has a bit of effect where you have to stop the technique, maybe, in that sense. Of course, my initial attack will have perhaps more penetrative force.
Absolutely.
But look at people look at some of the people who
Bruce Lee?
or people who come from classical fencing. There's this guy, French fencer called David Pascal. Yeah. He's like a complete acrobat. He's Spanish. Oh my God, sorry. And now he's never going to talk to me again. Anyway, he's like an acrobat, and he's not a big guy, but if just being able to move like he does. It is of course a huge advantage. So, and that is athleticism. If I'm just big and not athletic, I don't think that my my advantages are many. Maybe, as you said, I mean, I was doing a little bit
It's
of
reach and mass. That's all it is at that point. If you don't know how to use it, that's not an advantage at all. Like if I don't know what to do with my reach, like that's not an advantage.
I agree with Bjorn here. Athleticism is a much better category than just big or strong, because David Pascal will beat anyhow most of the big guys. Point final.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. That's the important thing. I think we always like circle back on is like just being bigger, just being that doesn't help at all if you don't know how to use it. Like that's the technique part. Or if you don't know, or if you're not trained, if you're just like this huge fat person that doesn't.
In the weapons that David Pascal uses, I think even if you're big and strong and fast, he's still better than you. This guy is really of superior quality.
I'm just a bigger target.
It's an exception, of course.
That might be a disadvantage as well. Sure, yeah, being a bigger target. But I think we have talked about like the pros and cons of being like of being built in a certain way.
There's one thing that I could
one thing that I would like to add, and then I would like to circle back on what Karin just hinted at, which is maybe is there a difference in having a female physique, or is there not? Maybe we'll see what she has to say about that. But Björn, you wanted to give your final impression on the whole big and strong thing.
So yes, size can also matter in the way, for example, that you basically just can't reach around. That would be something that can matter. I've experienced this. I did some Brazilian jiu-jitsu for a while, and we had a woman that was practicing it, and she was technically she was far superior to me. She was stronger, but you know, when her arm doesn't go around my neck, that it's like that it comes to a point where those kinds of things start mattering. But I think that again, that is something that applies more if you wind up on the ground and you're actually wrestling. Yeah, of course, if I just weigh a lot more than you, that alone will just take the air out of you. But aside from that, I'm not really sure how much of an advantage it is. Yeah, I think that this was what I wanted to add.
No, that's a perfect point. I mean, it's not just for like grabbing and throwing. It's also for things like if you want to execute a lock or something like that. The length of my arm is different from other people's length, and there are techniques that are not necessarily more difficult if you have longer or shorter forearms or something, but you have to know what you're doing there. So I think the point is, no matter if you are big or small or very like athletic or not, or the things you have to know your own body type, and you have to know the body type of your opponent, and then you can look at what makes sense to do and what doesn't. Like if I'm a very small, very slender person, I maybe shouldn't try to reach around you. I should do something else because I know what I'm physically, what is the best plan in this situation. So I think that is a very important thing, the knowing about my own physique. And maybe that's where we get into knowing about my own physique as a woman. Is there a difference for that?
Yes. So, okay, the other topic that we still have to address, which relates a little bit to the physiological and the physical one, is the gender topic, man versus woman, and maybe everything in between, but that's again another topic. I guess that the question then is, are women not necessarily always at a disadvantage, and how can they overcome this? I'm now putting it very frankly, because that's what I always feel is the topic. And I think that the answer should be very nuanced and needs to take a few, how would I say, background informations into account, because otherwise we easily fall into stereotypes which do not bring us any further. So one thing that we should know is that until 12, 13 years, until really puberty sets in, there is no physiological difference between boys and girls that is really significant. There is none. all the differences in prestation, and I don't say in mentality, but even there, but everything that has to do with being better or more agile or stronger or blah, 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 until that age are 100% cultural, 100%. It's only with what they call the secondary sexual wave, so the puberty, that which causes indeed several physiological changes which you see in the body. So the boys will start to grow quicker, the girl will start to get breasts, etc., etc., etc. This is always reduced to the matter of having testosterone or not. Let me inform you that women also produce testosterone and boys also produce estrogen. The one is, by the way, a precursor for the other. The physiological relations between the different sexes are much more close than we always tend to think. But of course, physiologically, during puberty, the difference between men and women becomes bigger. This is, again, very strongly culturally accentuated. So even if I would not say there is no difference at all, the differences are exacerbated extremely by cultural patterns of behavior. This comes down to the fact, and this starts already from the early youth, that a young boy is not only allowed, but also required, expected to develop physically, to learn to use his body, to move freely, to take the space, to climb trees, to throw balls, and to do all these kind of things, while girls from a very young age are not expected to do this, but expected to behave girlishly, and this is then so-called biologically ingrained, which it is absolutely not. It's a cultural pattern of behavior, and we know this very sure, because if you don't educate girls in that way, they behave at least until this puberty time in exactly the same physiological way as boys. So if you would educate all your children in a way that they would not behave like sitting like this and making themselves small and standing in strange ways and sitting with their legs always completely crossed so that when you stand up, you're almost stumbling over your own feet, then a lot of problems that girls would encounter later on to behave freely and make full use of their body in its full capacity would be non-existent. But this is hardly a subject of discussion. The emancipation of women up to now is 90% mental and intellectual. The emancipation of the female body has still to start. Don't forget as well that women only since a few decades, say 50 years, have the full right to do sports and to develop their bodies, and still even now are encountering ridiculous reactions and prejudices like women playing football until recently would be ridiculed, while we now see that they can reach high levels and do very nicely in these kinds of sports.
I suppose to stress the point of how cultural it is, if you look into the US, where football or soccer, as they call it, is a woman's sport, and guys don't play soccer, right? So it's a very cultural thing to have that idea.
Yeah. Thank you for this addition, which actually just underlines what I say, because in Europe then football, soccer is the male sport par excellence. So it's really, and also even with length and stature. If I went to China in 2015 for 2 months, I did a stage in Kunyushan, which is the mountain region in the northeast province of Shandong, where I was for 2 months in a traditional kung fu school, not a temple school, a school which was run by not monks, but regular Shaolin Kung Fu teachers, but high-level guys. Now, I was taller than 90% of the guys there, and I could almost lift up everybody with my own arm just like that. I mean, so, of course, in Europe, I'm not taller than 90% of the guys, but this shows how relative this is and how much other factors than pure biology play a role in it. I don't say that biology plays no role in it at all, but as long as we do not exclude all the other factors that make it more difficult for women to reach the top of their potential, then please let's forget all the bullshit about biology. And I'm talking now as a molecular biologist myself. People that saying, yeah, because you're a woman, you have no testosterone and your pelvis is big like that, so it's normal that you cannot move properly. Please stop with it. It's bullshit. If you learn young girls to be sportive and to develop their body in a confident way, even when in the puberty, some changes will arise that will make it a bit more difficult to have more muscle, etc., etc. But still, if you train, you will get the muscle. You have a bit more fat, but then they will still be able to train and come up to a level where they can deal with 80% of the situation. It is, by the way, true that in comparable populations, 80% of the individuals would not be genderable just by height. Only the 10% outliers on the small side would contain more women, and the 10% outliers on the big side would contain more men. But if you take these off and you make the new division over the new distribution over what remains, you cannot gender them just by height. Why then do we think that guys are always bigger than women? Because our culture represents it like such. Make a picture of a man and a woman, the man is bigger than the woman. Make a poster for a cinema motion picture, the man is bigger than the woman. Look at the vases of ancient Greece. Women did not have the same rights as men, but you will never see a picture where a man is bigger than a woman just because they're standing near each other. Look at the representations in ancient Egypt. If somebody is taller, it's because he is higher in rank. He's a king or she's a king, a queen or a god or a goddess, but not because he's physically different, you know. So this is really, again, something very cultural. And the problem is that if you can see this if you sit, for instance, in the metro or in the train or in the tram, and you look at how women sit, they sit like this. They take as little space as possible. Men open themselves. Okay, I'm not talking about this mansplaining, really stupid guys taking all the space, but just normal men being decent, they occupy their space. So a woman that comes, yeah, if I had to discover all this for myself, because, you know, the way you put your knees, I did not have proper development of my shoulders, although I am relatively strong by nature. I had to work on developing shoulders. Why? If you develop your shoulders as a woman, you're considered ugly. You cannot do that. How many girls are taken out of sports by their mothers when they're 16 because they would develop shoulders? Of course they would. If they train, they develop shoulders. And they shouldn't, because that's ugly. So you take them out, because otherwise they will not fit in the nice little shirt that you can buy. I mean, if I buy in my own measure the clothing that fit my body normally, just because I have a little bit of shoulder and I'm not Superwoman, I have a little bit of shoulder, it is often already a problem to just get your arm through it. So the idea is a woman cannot have an upper body. If you don't have an upper body, you don't have this upper triangle, you have no strength. You cannot hold your shirt, you cannot coordinate your upper body movements, you cannot push somebody away, you cannot hit somebody, you cannot lift something up. So you're completely handicapped. With the lower body, it's a little bit less because everybody has to use his legs or her legs, nevertheless. So there you have this problem, much less. If you look at sports where this discrimination is much less present, like CrossFit, then you see that women that train seriously have just normal upper bodies with broader shoulders than pelvis and strong legs. Voila, that's what the natural situation would be. So if you want to do away with a lot of the inequalities between men and women, you have to start your work there. Until that work is not done, it doesn't make any sense to talk about biology or blah, blah, blah. You have to start with developing the body up to its full capacity, so that this young woman, when she starts at 20 or 25 with martial art, is not like a handicapped person, under the level that she should have had she been educated physically in a normal way. And that's also a problem that many male coaches and trainers don't understand, not because of bad intentions. I'm always surprised how many coaches and trainers, male coaches and trainers, are full of the best intentions, really decent guys. But then they think, oh, well, I will treat all my pupils on an equal par because we're for equality, right? And of course, in principle, this is completely true. But this person, this girl, has never been treated equally. She comes there with a handicap. It's like a bright young guy with the brown skin that has been told, go to do professional education because university or gymnasium is nothing for you. Just because of what he looks like, what he is. And then after 6 years, he understands, but I'm intelligent enough, I want to go to university. And then they tell him, yeah, you can go. Of course, he will fail. He lacked the whole pre-education for that. So what do you need to do? You need to give this person the opportunity to catch up with some with some knowledge that he missed out on. Well, the same is true for physicality and women. You do not need to become the Hulk, but you can correct a lot of things that missed on the level of developing your upper body strength, of developing your stance of your legs, not the legs falling inside, but learning to put your knees and taking the space, learning to walk in the space and move through the space and taking your place and this kind of stuff. And this requires extra attention. And this requires also a certain psychological insight in what's happening, because if in the beginning the person is not helped on this way to catch up, you can do this during the normal training, but if this person is not helped, she will feel completely incompetent. It will add again to the already present lack of confidence, which the whole cultural context about what women are physically and that they cannot fight and they should not fight and they should not be too strong because then they are ugly and all this kind of bullshit. So it will only add to that. She will drop out and you will lose her. This you see very often. Girls come to the training, but after a few months, they're already gone and nobody understands why. Well, I do.
Self-fulfilling prophecy, basically. I think I will fail, and then therefore I fail. So that basically proves the point that I was not good enough.
But not because of her, because what was necessary to make her succeed, getting the chance to catch up, before you get to equal treatment, you have first to allow the person to get over this gap. Of course, you cannot undo a whole past for 20 years, but you can do more than enough to let's return to the comparison with the black guy that wanted to go to university after having done professional education. He does not have to do 6 years of gymnasium to get ready. No. You can train people in a very much shorter time, give them extra work, help them. There are a lot of programs like that. Catch up, and they have to work hard, of course. Yeah, they will have to work harder than other people who have some advantages. Yes, that's true, but they will make it. And give this a few generations of time and very much less. What then remains, if you would really properly do this, and what then remains, then you can start to talk about biology, but not before, in my opinion. And the whole of my approach with respect to, because you made reference to this in the beginning, I give this kind of workshops indeed on several places already. And I'm very happy to see that in the HEMA community, people are open to this and they invite me, and not only me, to talk about this, and they want to make progress on this. Apart from all bullshit that can happen, it's still a very open community with respect to this. And so we want to get our women up to the level where they should be and not up to the level where they are supposed to be. And there are a lot of concrete training tools and psychological methods and physiological methods applicable within normal training situations that can help to do this. And I want to contribute to this. And voila, saying to girls, of course you can dagger fight. And of course you can take that bigger guy if you know what to do and how to do it. Let's first work on your presence in space, and let's first make you get used to somebody grabs your arm, how to get out of this. Also good for self-defense situations. Many people, especially girls, will need this sometime in their life. So there is a lot of space to do this, and voila, that's actually all I want to say about this.
To sum up in a bit, so one aspect that you touched on, because hopefully with you as a guest again, we will delve into the psychological aspects on a different date more deeply. But the main point that you delved into now was, of course, there are physiological differences, but they are self-made. Basically, they are what we have. They are the mold that we kind of pour women into. It's not what they are, what they would naturally grow into. So yes, as an instructor, or yes, as a HEMA practitioner who is female, I have to be aware of certain differences, but they are not differences that are like magically there. They are there because I have basically been molded into that shape, and I can change that. It's something that's not like a law of nature, basically. So most of what we see in differences, even though they may be important, if I have been raised like that and I am to face a big, strong male, you know what, stereotypical difference opponent, of course that gives me a disadvantage. But those are things that I can change, and that's something that we should look into. I think Björn wanted to add something, and then I would like...
I want to react to that because I agree only partially, but...
Okay. It was supposed to be a summary, so if you disagree with that, I did a bad job. So
No,
you have to...
no.
You can clarify in a second.
Just a small clarification, because I think it's... No, you did not a bad job at all, but being precise in this matter is important. So Björn will allow me a few minutes to say this. I do not say there is no biological difference at all. No. I only say that the biological difference is much less important than we make it to be, because of the reason that you summarized nicely. We aggrandize it and we put women in this mold, and that's the old patriarchal society that we are still inheriting, although it's changing, luckily, slowly, but luckily it's changing. And of course, if you have been being put in that mold from childhood upwards, then you will be physiologically and psychologically marked by this, and then you will feel feeble and you will have less developed than you should. And then, of course, it's not only up to you to change that, it's up to your whole environment to help you to change that, and to yourself. That's the only thing I wanted to add.
Yeah, that's totally how I got this, which is why I will come back to the little bit that might remain after we heard what Björn wanted to add.
Yes, good.
So I was thinking that, first of all, I think it's interesting that fencing as such, or because in the context, I think that dagger is also fencing. So we know is one of the athletic pursuits where I think we have fairly well documented female participation from a very, very absolute oldest source. I mean, 133. It's called the Walpurgis document because the Walpurgis is there now, and it quite often shows up, and we have documented several instances of this. So I think that is interesting in itself, that fencing very clearly was one of those places where there was perhaps cultural stigma, but still some wriggle room, even in a much less egalitarian society than ours, which I think we can all agree that medieval Europe was. And also, I think that we can. I want to kind of like say something good about the HEMA community, because I think that it is the most. I grew up in martial arts. I have been into my whole life, and I must say that HEMA is absolutely the martial art I've been involved in where there is the most kind of like egalitarian mindset, and that these kind of things are so much more made aware. And like I told you last time, or a few times ago, when I visited Tremonia Fechten, I really was impressed by how well that event took place. Which, I mean, just the amount of people, and combined with alcohol and of course a larger degree of men present than women. I was a bouncer for 20 years. I mean, I was sitting there kind of waiting for something to happen, to somebody to be behaving unpleasantly towards some woman, and nothing. I was like, no, okay, that just doesn't happen here. And I'm so happy that this is something that is with this community to a larger degree than with others. That doesn't mean that problems don't exist.
Yeah, and we should watch out for those and make sure that doesn't happen. Yeah,
of course.
Good. Okay, good. That's so much for the praise of the HEMA community.
Yeah, because I just want to add that I agree to a large extent, but still, let's not underestimate, there is still a lot of bullying, and there is a lot of maybe unconscious machismo that has devastating consequences sometimes. Okay, the women should stand up for themselves, and the HEMA community is an open community. I agree with it, but there nevertheless is still a lot of work to be done.
It is an open community as long as we make it one. That's like, we have to keep doing that. Yeah. So to get to a final point on this, we have talked about differences in size and athleticism, and that the peculiar thing about dagger is that it works like a magnifying glass. Like you can feel these things more strongly maybe than you would with a long sword as the staple HEMA weapon basically. And we have talked about how a good technique can kind of level out a lot of the advantages or disadvantages that you might have physically. And we have finally delved into the specifics of maybe the female body in HEMA, which a lot of that, as we have learned, is what we make female bodies, what we as a culture produce basically as female bodies. And you said, if we take all that away, there is a tiny rest of what is actually biology. And I would like for all of those people out there who think, but there are these biological differences, what in fact, if we get to the point where we support our female training partners to the point where they can actually develop their physique properly, what actually remains? If I am a female practitioner, what should I know about my own body that may be important, that may be different? What should I, as an instructor, me personally, what should I know if we get to that point? What difference is there still that I should keep in mind, or is it so minute that you can basically throw it out the window?
I think, no, your question is right, but the focus is not right. It's not that remaining small biological difference that is interesting. It's the big cultural one that is relevant.
Yeah,
there we have to work upon. And there we will have still some generations of work to get, because we do not know even exactly what the remaining differences are. We know that they are very small, and we see this in the very few sports where real egalitarianism is more pronounced, not yet completely reached, but more pronounced. And we see, for instance, I did some CrossFit. That's why I'm a little bit informed about this. There are certainly other examples as well. But in CrossFit, for instance, you also have weightlifting and this kind of typical disciplines that are always considered very male, but everybody has to do them. Now, the weights that are lifted in the top category of athletes by the females now are the ones that were lifted 5 years ago by the top men. You see, so there is a very quick narrowing of this gap. I don't say that it will be closed completely. I think there still will, but it's not important what is remaining. The point is, what is important now is we have to learn women that, or to teach our girls and to encourage them also to develop athleticism, which means that for them, they will have to work on their upper body because it was artificially underdeveloped, because they have to fulfill a certain standard of so-called femininity, like if you are ugly because you have developed shoulders. Look at the good athlete. Is she ugly? She's not ugly. She's very elegant, but she looks strong. And that is what the culture does not accept. A woman should not look strong. She should look vulnerable. That's the heritage of the dominance of the male over the women that we have, and we should get rid of this. How do we do this? To teach our girls to develop proper athleticism if they want to perform on the top level in a discipline like sword fighting. Not like we can, of course, encourage by specific trainings for women, by having competitions for women, but our goal should not be to create a separate women's world. No. Open, by the way, this also would cope nicely with all discussions about trans and blah, blah, blah. Open competition should stay the norm, but our training and other competitions can exist, of course, and nobody should be obliged. But it should not be that women should be obligatory pushed in some separate category, because then you just install the whole situation that exists now as the norm for the future. While there is a lot of space for improvements, and it will be the next generations that will reap the fruits of this if we do our job properly. I teach my little workshops on what toolboxes do trainers have to work with girls on this during normal training, but even this program already helps a little bit because it raises awareness. And I'm very happy that you wanted me here for this, not only for this, of course. I'm not only talking as a woman about women, but it is important, and I want to contribute. People can have other visions on this than I have. I don't care. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. But voila. So we have to work on what can be culturally undone and what can bring girls and women as high on the level physically and psychologically as they could be. And what then remains will be in my opinion, so limited that it's like, okay, you also have a male athlete that is a little bit taller and faster than somebody else. He has a little advantage. Yeah, okay. That's it. There it stops. But we're so far away from that this is not my problem right now. You know.
So the answer that we would give someone who says, but the biological differences is, how do you know what the differences are?
Yes.
If we don't even develop both properly.
That's exactly the point. Thank you very much for this.
Good. I thank you very much. And I think this is a perfect point to wrap this up. Thanks everyone who has been watching for this long. I hope it has been as entertaining and fun for you as it has for me. I think this was a great conversation, and I'm already looking forward to the next one where we delve into the psychology of things more and get less physical and more mental. Thank you, Björn. Thank you, Karin, and see you all in the next one.